Welcome to all of you with us in person today and those of you joining us online. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch for Into the Forest, a Holocaust story of survival, triumph, and love by Rebecca Frankel. We first met Rebecca here at the museum in January 2020, when she came to the museum to attend a reunion of the Bielski partisan family, who some of you may know from the film Defiance. And she told us at the time that she was working on researching a new book project about a family that survived the Holocaust in the forest. It's a great honor to celebrate the product of that research now, a year and a half later, which was just released by St. Martin's Press on September 7th. You may know Rebecca as family or friends, or as the author of the New York Times best-selling book, War Dogs, Tales of Canine Heroism, History, and Love. And Love. She was also the executive editor at Foreign Policy magazine, and her work has appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and elsewhere. Into the Forest is a well-researched and emotionally gripping love story, but it's a particularly remarkable book because it's set against the backdrop of the Holocaust by Bullets, a little-known chapter of Holocaust history that we are only now starting to fully understand. And it's stories like the one Rebecca has unearthed and told in Into the Forest that are helping fuel that deeper understanding. In addition to Rebecca Frankel, we're honored to be joined today by David Rothkopf, host of the Deep State Radio podcast and CEO of the Rothkopf Group. David's father survived the Holocaust in Austria. After David and Rebecca's discussion today, copies of Into the Forest will be available for sale in our museum lobby. We hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity to buy the book and get your copy signed by the author. And those of you joining us for the live stream can order your copy of Into the Forest at the link in the live stream chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Frankel and David Rothkopf to the stage.
Hello, thank you all for being here.
Hi, very nice of you to join us. I think we're going to have a very interesting afternoon, and hopefully at some point, perhaps about 40 minutes from now, you will have the chance to join in and ask some questions. So you may want to think about that as we go forward. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
It's a pleasure to have you here with me today.
You know, I remember the first time you brought up this book. I was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and Becky was, I think, the executive editor, or the managing editor at that time.
Something like
which meant
that.
I had an office and would sit there, and Becky would do the work, and then come in and say, here's a good magazine, and I'd go, yeah, that's pretty good. But at some point after War Dogs, this is, by the way, the curse of all authors. As soon as you finished a book, people go, are you going to write another book? Yeah. You know, they don't give you a break. And,
No.
and almost immediately, you know, like you went and you did the Conan O'Brien show with War Dogs. And now she's doing this, so moving up. And we came back and you were like, well, there's this story I'm interested in.
Yes.
That you came upon. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure.
How did you come upon the story?
Well, in a way, I didn't actually come upon it. It was sort of always in the background of my growing up. The rabbi where my parents and my family were members of the synagogue. He and his wife had this incredible story of how they met and how their paths crossed as children. Their families were interned in the same ghetto in a small town in Poland. And Ruth, the rabbi's wife, her mother intervened on the rabbi's behalf when he was an 11-year-old boy. And later, decades later, after the families had gone their separate ways and survived the war, there was this random encounter at a wedding in Brooklyn. And Rabbi was there, and he met this woman who knew Ruth's family and was reconnected to the woman who had saved him in the Holocaust, and then went to see her in Hartford, Connecticut, and met her very becoming older daughter. And they started this sort of slow simmering romance from there. So attending Beth Hillel Synagogue, where Rabbi was the rabbi, as we all call him Rabbi, this story was sort of always in the background, and Rabbi's story was a little bit better known. So this romance was a part of it, but I didn't really know Ruth's family story very well. And so when I finally decided that another book might be something I would want to do, I thought, well, if I'm going to do another book, it has to be a topic that I care about very much. It has to be a great story, and it has to be involve a subject that I find sort of endlessly fascinating, endlessly interesting, and certainly there's no limit to that with this story. But then I started to talk to both of them. They said that sure, yes, if you want to write a book, that's okay. And then it really just became about my conversations with Ruth, and I was introduced to her family, the Rabinowitz family, who this features in this book. And I was introduced to her parents, Miriam and Morris, and not just how they survived the Holocaust and how they survived in the forest, but really just to what incredible people they were. And I think that that's another component to this book that I hope people walk away from, getting to know Morris and Miriam Rabinowitz and getting to know what kind of people they were.
I think the great thing about the book is that it is that human story. But through revealing a human story, you reveal something about bigger issues, the nature of history and of life on Earth. And I think one of them just comes to me as we're talking here, and that is that the book begins with normal life, and it ends with normal life. And in the middle is this unthinkable reality. And you know, that's not just a lesson of the Holocaust. I think it's a lesson of all times.
Yeah.
And that gives it a kind of a universality. Did that strike you as you were grappling with this?
I mean, it did on a lot of levels, because really what happened is they were going about their lives, their normal lives. And it didn't just happen overnight. It happened over years. It happened over decades. And for most of the people that it happened to, it was a totally unthinkable thing, right? Even when they heard, so this is taking place in this small town, in Yiddish it's called ghetto. And so this part of Poland was occupied first by the Soviets. And in relatively speaking, this was fortunate for the Jews living there, because while under the Soviet occupation, things were controlled, their lives were limited, there were abuses and there was violence. People were taken away to Siberia, but they weren't taken away and killed. And there's testimony and records, and people talk about how refugees came in from the western part of Poland, the part of Poland that was occupied by Germany, and they came and they told stories about what was happening to the Jewish people there. And people could not believe that this could be true. And what struck me about that is not that there was a naivete to this, or that there was a lack of being prepared or being willing to take big risks and run while there was still time. But actually what it was this, the humanity that these people had, that they couldn't possibly imagine that people, Germans, Nazis, whoever, could do this to other people, that it was truly unimaginable. And so it being immersed in these testimonies, being immersed in these stories and these memoirs, it's hard to imagine even now that it could, that it could happen again, and yet, of course, something terrible could happen again. I just, and in particular, getting to know Miriam and Morris and the way that they dealt with what was happening to them, I think they were very unique in some ways, not just because they were really independent people or they were particularly courageous people, but just because they had a strong marriage and a family where there was a lot of love and a commitment to stay together no matter what. And that made a big difference in their experience.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, when I read it, you know, I was struck by that they seemed like ordinary people at the beginning, and they were leading ordinary lives. But that when events like this intrude on your lives, it's that idea of ordinariness is swept aside. And what happens is people are put to a test. And when you know, I mean, the book is called Into the Forest. When they go into the forest, that's the test. And maybe you could describe a little bit about the nature of that test and how intense it was.
Sure. Well, so it's interesting to think about it. I know the whole story. Anyone who reads the book is going to know the story about what happened to them. But when they went to the woods, it was the only safe place for them to go. So they were escaping these horrific conditions. They were escaping a ghetto liquidation. Their neighbors, their friends, and their family members had just been murdered. And it was the only place to go. And the family, as they've told me, that Morris would say for years later, if I had known what the woods was going to be like, I would never have gone in. And so, you know, the test that they were faced with was just about how to survive. And Morris was in a unique position to do this because his normal life, in his normal life, he had been a lumber dealer. And so what that meant in this small rural town is that he had a knowledge of the forest, which was important given what they were facing. He had very good relationships with the local Christian farmers, both Poles and Belarusians. And so he had these friendships to rely on. And the other people that escaped the ghetto who knew him knew that Morris had this good position. He and another family, the Feldman family, they were wealthy, and so they had gold with them, and they had belongings to trade for food or for information about where the Nazis were. And so they were just uniquely positioned to do well under these circumstances. And there was a group of people who wanted to be with them no matter what. And Morris's position was always that to be in a large group, to be around a lot of other people, put them in greater danger. And they just wouldn't leave. And so at a certain point, he accepted that these people were a part of his responsibility. And he became, as I say in the book, the reluctant leader of this group. And they went, you know, they migrated often, they had to leave certain places that became unsafe after they were discovered, and this happened, of course, over a period of 2 years. But what's interesting to me is interviewing one of the grandsons of Ruth and Rabbi. Now, both sides of his family, the Lazowski family, Rabbi's family, and Ruth's side, the Rabinowitz family, they both went through this Holocaust. And he had 2 grandfathers that survived, Rabbi's father, Joseph, and Ruth's father, Morris. And he said, in a conversation that we had, which was very interesting to me to learn this about them, he said that his grandfather, Morris Rabinowitz, what happened to him made him the man that he was, and that it gave him, it was this test that you mentioned. He found something within him, and he became kind of reborn in a way, however reluctantly it was. And his other grandfather, Joseph, he said about him that experience broke him, that the man he was before the war, he could never really recover from it. And of course, he went on, and he survived the woods also in different circumstances, Rabbi's father, but that he was never the same. He could never really, truly re-find who he was or his happiness in some way. At least that's how I interpreted what he told me in that conversation. So whatever it was, whatever this family went through, and Miriam and Morris, their relationship survived. What happened to them in the woods, and their love, I think, only continued to blossom over time, which is pretty amazing.
Well, it is amazing, and I think one of the things that I hope all of you watching this and sitting here with us take away from this is that while this is a real story of real people, it reads with the drama of a novel. It plays in your head like a movie. And one of the things that strikes me, and I don't think it, it gives away, the substance of the book, is something that's been cited in a couple of these reviews, which is, I'll paraphrase what one of them said, but essentially, no saints survived in the woods.
Yeah.
And I think maybe you should talk about that a little bit. What does that mean?
Well, so it was interesting. The origin of this, of course, for me as a writer, came with my relationship to Ruth and to Rabbi. And so the first people I interviewed for this book were Ruth, Rabbi Lazowski, and Ruth's younger sister, Toby. And of course, in the book, and I'm sorry I didn't say this earlier, but in the book, Ruth's, the name that she was given when she was born is Rachel, and Toby's name is Tanya, and I know them as Ruth and Toby now. But in interviewing them, so many years later, it was incredible, first, of course, how much of these memories were still with them. They were deeply rooted in a lot of emotion. And of course, they were deeply tied to the family members, and to what happened to her parents and in the woods. But it was also colored, of course, by how well loved and how well protected they were. And it wasn't just because they were young children. It was because they had adults who had survived, who were taking care of them and who were protecting them. Because what happened in the woods was really terrible. And it was, as Toby, the younger Rabinowitz daughter, has said, it wasn't as horrific as what happened in the concentration camps, but it was awful. And they would wake up to people who had died from hypothermia or who had starved to death, and they would see bodies. But they also had happy memories from the woods, which, after I became familiar with other people's testimony, people who had survived in the same woods or nearby, the things that they talked about, there was absolutely no room for happy memories. There was one woman, in fact, who her testimony really has stayed with me because it was so hard to listen to. But she escaped a ghetto liquidation at the age of 12 with another girlfriend of hers, and they fled to the woods. And there were people around them who she knew from growing up, who were friends of her parents, and she went to them to help her. And they did so initially begrudgingly, and then what they used to do is that none of them would let them sleep in their tents or the zemlankas, which are these underground bunkers that they would build in the woods to keep hidden, but also to keep warm in the winter. They wouldn't let her sleep in there with them, and so she would sleep outside on the ground. And in the middle of the night, they would leave camp, and they would leave her behind because she was just another mouth to feed, and they didn't want her. She wasn't a very particularly big girl, so she wasn't very strong. There was nothing she could really do to participate or to contribute. And so she was constantly left behind. And, to compare the two experiences of young girls who are about relatively the same age, lucky doesn't feel like quite the right word to apply to any of this, but I was constantly reminding myself or referring back to the memories of Ruth and Toby and the Rabinowitz family, and then comparing them, of course, to get a bigger perspective of what the overall experience in the woods truly was. And there, were people who helped each other. There's certainly examples of it. But after a certain point of being cold and hunted down and starving, that self-preservation becomes kind of the only thing, or at least it did for many people. And there are people who talk about their experiences, and they were turned away, or they'd ask someone for help and they said no, and they would say, but I don't blame them. I'm not upset with them. So yeah, there weren't a lot of saints.
I think if I confess to you in the audience, I was an English major, which shows a real lack of character.
I was also an English major.
and judgment on my part. But, I think if this were a novel, people would say, very clever, Rebecca. They are leading these very civilized lives. And they go into the woods, and it becomes about surviving. They sort of return to a state of nature. It's not about the values that you've got in your daily life. It's not about goodness. They're mothers muffling their children so that they're not heard, and sometimes that is to, the child doesn't survive that. That's the horror of this. But, one of the things that has always struck me about this is this is a universal experience. This didn't just happen once in history. This happens all the time in history. The slogan associated with places like this is, like never again.
Yeah.
But that's a lie, folks. That it will happen again because it always happens in human history. And this is about how people keep going in the midst of it.
There is, so there are these three men from ghetto, which is how I refer to them during my years of research. I came across.
How many years of research?
I did almost 6 years, or at least from the time that I first started interviewing Ruth until the time I made my last edit. And they were boys in shuttle together, and 2 of them were brothers, and 1 of them was a friend, and they had all stayed friends. And I think the video was recorded by one of their sons in the 90s, and the 3 of them are sitting together on a couch, and they're joking and they're laughing in Yiddish. And the son does a very good job of interviewing them. So it's 2 brothers from the Abramowitz family, Morris and Irving, and this man named R.L. Laro. Lazarich was his family name in Poland. And they're talking about what they went through, and 2 of the men had joined the partisans in the woods, and so they had been in these battalions fighting after they escaped the ghetto. And in one of his testimonies, because he gave many over time, R.L. did, and there was one attack on the woods early on, so probably in the early fall of 1942, just after the Jews had fled most of these ghettos. The ghetto liquidations ended mostly by that fall. A lot of them mostly happened in the summer. And it was just brutal. Most of the Jews who were there were killed. A lot of the early iterations of the partisan units that were formed at that time had been killed. And he said, I don't know why we did it. I don't know how we did it. We were supposed to have killed ourselves, committed suicide. But instead what they did is they picked up whatever tools they could find, and they dug into the absolutely frozen ground, and they started again. And I think sometimes it's inexplicable why some people, or what reasons they had to keep going and what reasons they had not to, because, often what I encountered was more reasons not to keep going than reasons to keep going. But in the Rabinowitz family story, they had each other, and it just made, all the difference in the world on a day-to-day basis, and throughout their 2 years, almost exactly to the day of being in the woods.
Well, that's, again, it's kind of one of the core themes here to me is that the reason people survive, and this goes to, you don't have to live through the Holocaust to discover this reason, is each other, is family, is connectedness, and it's for each other, one way or another. And that's why I think the resolution underscores that. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. When I first started the book, in doing the book proposal, which is like writing a mini book in some ways, I really wanted to make sure that all of the most incredible things about this story were presented at the beginning, because that's really the way to get people interested, to know that there's this love story, and to know, because it would be impossible to argue that one Holocaust survival story has more value than another. They don't. They're all important. We should know as many as we can. But when you are trying to get people to read a book, you have to tell them why this is a rare story or why it's interesting or different. And so I started with this the love story of Ruth and Rabbi, Ruth Rabinowitz and Philip Lazowski, the surviving children, and how they encounter each other, because it is pretty miraculous, and a lot of people have said if it wasn't a true story, I wouldn't believe that it happened. But the other love story, of course, is Morris and Miriam, and finding that was really gave the book, I think, its soul, and the story its soul, because they don't just have an incredible story, they were incredible people, and the way they lived their lives is an example I think we could all use now. One of the things I think about a lot myself is, what was it that prompted Miriam in the midst of literally a massacre to turn to an 11-year-old boy who had no one, who approached her during this massacre and said, "Please pretend that I'm your son." And she, in a minute, she said yes, and it was a very dangerous thing to do that, to take in a strange boy who had no papers, that she had no connection to. She didn't know him at all. She was separated from her husband at this point. Morris had been pushed away in the crowd, and she had her 2 young daughters with her. And that moment, among others, of course, I think for the family and the generations that would come later from, Morris and Miriam's union, and eventually the one that Rabbi and Ruth would have later on, it's like a legacy moment for their family. And I know the Lazowski family and the surviving Rabinowitz family members, that this moment in Miriam's action is something they think about all of the time. That, she decided to do this thing when it would have been easier to say no, and many people turned this young boy away and said no to him. But she didn't. And I think, in one of the reviews, they say there's a lot of karmic righteousness. And I think, yes, there was for their family, that their good deeds or their approach to life or their approach to helping other people, there was a reward. I mean, that moment literally secured the future generations of Miriam's family in a way.
So maybe there were some saints.
Yes, I think so.
But, one of the things that struck me, and it strikes me as I'm talking to you, and it strikes me given where we're having this conversation, is that if you're Jewish and you read this story, you probably know somebody or have a relative who has a similar experience. The part of Poland that they live, my grandfather came from there. Escaping the Nazis. My dad fled the Nazis, and I had a cousin who walked across Europe as a 9-year-old girl, sort of sleeping in haystacks, and walked from Austria to Portugal as a way of escaping. So we all have those stories. Why should somebody who's not Jewish read it?
Well, certainly this is a part of history that we should all know. That's an easy answer to that question. It's interesting. I did think about this a lot, because growing up Jewish, growing up in a Hebrew school where the rabbi and his wife are Holocaust survivors, this was very much part of the DNA of our community, to know this history, to talk about it. And so in engaging in this history and doing the research and encountering the truly horrific parts of this, what the Nazis did to the Jews being one of them, that was something that I was sort of already prepared to encounter, and people who have this background, whether or not it's your family or somebody that you know or you learn about it in school, this is what you learn. But the thing that I found so absolutely horrifying, and certainly those other things were too, is listening to these survivors talk about what happened in their community, and that people who they were friends with, who they were close to, their neighbors, their teachers, there was a breakdown in these communities. And there's so many reasons why, and I'm not saying these were bad people, and I'm not saying they were just good or bad people. It was a terrible time, and terrible things were happening. But I think it is valuable to know what a community that stands together, a community that does approach things with kindness and humanity can do, and how they can survive, and what happens to communities where people don't do that. And I think we're at a moment where, it's important to hear about these things and to talk about them, and it doesn't have to be necessarily about the Holocaust. I mean, I think, and maybe this is a little bit about what you were saying, but that, communities are going to be tested, and there are going to be breakdowns in the norms that we have and how we're meant to treat each other. And if this can be a lesson for us all to be kinder, then it doesn't necessarily have to be a Holocaust story. It's just a people story.
When I went to Berlin the first time, and I guess I was in my 20s or something, and I went there and had this kind of strange feeling as I was walking down the street, and I would see these people, and I would look at them and I would think, these are the children of the people who did these terrible things. And I thought to myself, they look normal, they look like the people I'm with in my life. And then I thought, that's the point, is that there is this banality to this, that everybody is capable of tolerating really, really bad things in their lives, particularly if they don't think it affects them directly. Is that a theme that you encounter in terms of the others in the community? Because the other people in these communities tolerated it.
They certainly did. And then it came to a point where, it was a matter of not just tolerating it, but in defying the norms that were being put into place, the laws and the rules and the restrictions. The penalty was death, or something not too far off in terms of how terrible it was. And I think a lot about the people in the surrounding forest communities, these very poor farmers who were sort of nearby the woods or adjacent to the woods. And some of them chose to reach out to the Jews that they knew were hiding there and let them know when the Nazis were getting close so that they could change the location and hide. And then some of them informed on the Jews that they knew who were hiding there and turned them in. And sometimes it was, the reward for doing this. I came across some documentation, and it was, for something about the equivalent of a cup of sugar or a bag of flour. And so for me, what that made me think is either this is how little a Jewish life was valued, or this is how terrible their circumstances were as well, that they would make a decision to send innocent people to their death because this is how desperate they were for something to eat. So, I certainly think that that's part of it, but it's...
I think, it's also... it's a beautiful story. It's very specific. It's about very particular people going through a particular experience. But as with all stories like that, there is a universality that pertains to it. And it's not, how do we survive? Why do we survive? What are we up against is part of it. But the fact that there is this sort of systematic destruction of societies is also with us all the time. As I sit here talking to you, I remember you and I once, and by you and I, by the way, she once did something and I was in the room. But you remember, I remember you put together a great photo essay about Afghanistan. And it was a photographer, and he'd gone into a hospital.
Oh, right.
That had, and we had destroyed it. We had, and you could see operating tables, and you could see, it sort of manifested the inhumanity of this. This is, we were doing this, and 170,000 people died in Afghanistan. We talk about a couple thousand American soldiers. 170,000 died there. Maybe 800,000 people died in Iraq. 5-6 million people died in Central African Republic. I mean, we can go and, there's these long, long lists of these things. But it seems to me that all this is, there are these sepia pictures in this. But it seems to me that this is all with us.
Well, we used to talk about this at Foreign Policy a lot. We would talk about, we'd have editorial meetings and talk about what's the best way to tell this story. And what David was just referring to was the hospital bombing in Kunduz, where there was some alleged report that there were Taliban members hiding out in this area, and the U.S. went in and destroyed a hospital and ended up killing a lot of innocent civilians. But, I think the idea was, how do we tell this story, and how do we tell the human story of this? Where do we find the people in this story, and where do we, not to be too literal, but point the lens in a way that it's not just so remote and so distant and something that doesn't pertain to our everyday lives. And the way that we did that was we found out the identity of one of the people who had been killed, and we did a 3-part story on this man and what happened to him that day. And then we learned about his family and his circumstances. And I'm still very proud of that work that we did, and the photographer's name is Andrew Quilty. But I think that's so much a part, because, speaking to what you were saying about this being universal, that is the way to make these connections real. It's always going to be the stories of people and what happened to them. And, the closer we can get to their voices and to their experiences, and the better we get to know them, I think the better we'll connect with them, and the better we understand them.
In a minute, what I think we should do is look at some of these people.
Oh, yes.
Because you have some pictures of the people. But I just want to say as an aside that this morning on Twitter, I saw a tweet by Andrew Quilty.
Oh, you did?
And he said he's still in
Kabul.
And he said that he went to his favorite barber, and the barber told him that the Taliban had come in and said, "You're no longer allowed to cut beards."
Oh.
And it just, it kind of resonated to me again with all of this.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about some of these pictures?
So let's see. So these are some of my favorite pictures. This is Rochel and Tanya Rabinowitz, or Ruth and Toby, as I've been speaking about them. And this photo was taken in their backyard in ghetto, I think in 1938 or 1939, so this is before their lives were disturbed. Miriam used to like to dress them in matching clothes, and Ruth would tell me about this photo, and she said that she loved the shoes that she had. They were red buckle shoes, and they were her favorite shoes. And this story has an interesting history to it. So again, we see a young Ruth and Toby and a friend of theirs, and in front of Miriam's shop. And in Jettel, Miriam owned a little, it wasn't quite a pharmacy. They sold mostly, home remedies and things like that, maybe some clothes. And the reason why this photo is so creased and why it has a little tear is because after the war, when they were trying to get to Israel, and it was illegal for Jewish refugees at the time to just come to Israel, but of course, so many Jews wanted to go to Palestine, as it was then, before Israel became a state, that it was going to be this Jewish safe haven where they could go and be free and be Jews without fear. And so they couldn't travel as Poles. They had to travel as Greeks in order to pass all of these borders illegally, but with fake papers that they had. And so all of these families were told that they couldn't bring anything with them that would identify them as being from Poland, or as Jews for that matter. And so what they had to do was rip out anything that had Polish language, and so Morris couldn't bring himself to, abandon these photos, so that's what he did. He made this tiny tear and got rid of the Polish advertisement in the window of Miriam's shop so that he could take it with him. And this again is one of the photos that Morris brought with him because it has all of these creases in it. And this is a photograph of Ruth Ruchel's kindergarten class, and that was the last time she was in school when she was a girl before the war. And she's at the second row. Oh, yeah. She's in the second row, and one of the first times I was at their house doing interviews for the book, she showed me this photo, and when she was putting it down, she said she's the only person who managed to survive in that photo. So all of these young children and the teachers that were with them, this was a Jewish school, they were all killed. And this is another very important photo in the family archive. And this is the first photo of the family taken after they came out of the woods. So we have Miriam in the middle, and then her two daughters, and there's another woman in the photo who was with them in the woods, and a friend that they weren't able to identify for me. But as you can see, they're very thin. Their clothes are very ill-fitting. They were wearing donated clothes. They didn't really have very much when they came out of the woods. So it is a happy photo because, of course, they've survived, but they don't quite look like themselves. And this is one of the first photos that was taken of the family when they finally made it to a tiny fishing village in Italy, which was meant to be the quick jumping off point of where they could take a boat from the coast of Italy and make their way over to Palestine. And it's Miriam and Morris are in the front sitting down. Of course, you have the two girls, and with them on the right over here is their Aunt Luba, Miriam's sister. And they are wearing dresses that they had made before the war in Vilna. Miriam and Luba traveled to Vilna, and they got matching dresses. And they left these dresses with a Polish farmer, a friend of Morris and Miriam's, and they kept their dresses for them and their other belongings safe throughout the war. And when they made it out of the woods, they went back, and they were still there to claim. And then this is a wonderful photo because you see how happy and bright-eyed they are. And it's not that's much later. It's a photo from Italy. The girls both say that Italy is the place where they became children again after surviving the war and going to Italy. It's very beautiful, Santa Maria dell'Erca. The Italians who were there were very welcoming to the Jewish refugees, and even though there were 4 families to a small house, there was a lot of joy, a lot of happiness of being together and having survived. And again, just happy photos from Italy, which are wonderful to see because it took them, perhaps a shorter time than other people, but to sort of fill out, to get tan, to be happy, to go back to school, to find community. So I think probably they're not going to be much different from here on. So again, just as the girls are getting older, I think Italy was a wonderful place for them, and they were so set on going to Israel that they stayed quite a while, and eventually that option wasn't available to them, so they came to the United States. But I think that's good for photos, probably.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then I think we'll go to some questions from the audience. This is a story with a happy ending, but it's very dark at its center. The toll that it took on these people, there are pictures here of smiling people, it must have left scars that are with them still to this day. How do you see the scars? What do they look like to you?
Well, it's interesting because my doing research and doing interviews with Ruth and Toby, who are still with us, and who are, being a part of this book coming out into the world, and that is a particularly wonderful thing for me personally, and I know for a lot of people who care about them. They were far enough away from these experiences that there wasn't a tremendous amount of emotion in our immediate conversations. Both sisters gave Shoah Foundation testimonies in the mid-90s, and it was startling to me to watch them because both women cried profusely. It was obviously very difficult for them to resurface these memories. And I didn't encounter that too much with them. Although what would happen occasionally, one instance with Toby, I had found someone that they met in Italy, a very young girl, who had survived by, her parents had given her, when she was a baby, to a Catholic Polish woman, and this woman managed to hide her with the family, and she survived that way. And then, unfortunately, this woman who survived the war, her parents had survived the woods like the Rabinowitzes, she met sort of a tragic end in a car accident. And I initially asked Toby about this woman. Her name was Yolanda Benson, and she said she remembered her because there are photos of her, and she remembered she was a very, interesting little girl. She had grown up believing that she was Catholic, and so the girls were sort of astonished to see someone Jewish wearing a cross around their necks. And then I said, well, I'm going to try and see if I can find her. Maybe, she's still alive and I can interview her. And Toby said, okay. And, she called me a couple of days later and she said, I don't know why I couldn't tell you, but she's not alive. She died when she was in her 20s, and it was very tragic. And she said, in the phone, she said, I was upset with myself. I should have told you, but I just couldn't bring myself to say it. And so it didn't always surface in our conversations, but I know a lot of this was difficult for them. And in fact, there's a man by the name of Ted Weinstone, who is now in his 90s, and he lives in Memphis, Tennessee. And I was able to go to Memphis and interview him. He had been in the woods with the Rabinowitz family. And I went to interview him, and I spent a couple of days there, and we had very long conversations, hours at a time. And, at wrapping up our last conversation, I was talking to him, and his memory is absolutely astounding. He remembers dates, numbers, times of days, the distance between the places they were. It was tremendously helpful to me to speak with him. And I said, Ted, this is amazing. Your memory is just incredible. And he said, it's not so good. He said, the memories disturb him. And he told me afterwards that in anticipation of my visit, he hadn't slept for a long time, that he knew he would have to talk about it. He knew it would be upsetting. And he didn't say any of this to me until the end. But that it's, after all of this time, it doesn't get any easier to share it. And it wasn't easy for me to tell during our conversations that it was difficult, but of course it was, and why wouldn't it be?
Well, and that's why the book is so important. It's so important to have books like this. Again, my father he escaped, but 36 members of his family didn't escape, and some of them lived in villages like this, and he never talked about it. Yeah. His mother didn't talk about it. We didn't get to know about these things, and towards the end of his life, he would start sending us little bits of memory, short stories or notes about who died and when and stuff. But it's all there inside of these people all the time. And we're getting to the point where many of them are going to pass on.
Yeah.
And if we don't turn to them, we're not going to have those stories. And that's why it's so important that a sensitive, gifted journalist like Becky can go to them and draw this out, because otherwise it will be lost for always. I think we have time for some questions. Is that correct? I see one up here.
Yes, thank you so much for this rich discussion. We're going to turn to audience questions now, and we're accepting them from audience members both in person and online. So we'll start with an online question, and then I'll get to you. Those of you watching the live stream should feel free to share your questions in the live stream chat, and those of you here with us in person, just raise your hand. Our first question comes from an audience member named Felice, who asked if you could explain a little bit about your research to understand the background of this story, the Holocaust by bullets and the killings in the East.
Sure. So of course, as I said, I started with the people that I was writing about, and I interviewed them, and I realized I had a lot of education to find for myself in order to be able to orient what happened to them into not just the the timeline of the Greater War and of the Holocaust, but also of the town in ghetto, what happened in the woods, what happened in the ghetto and the DP camps. To do this, I knew that it would not be fair to rely on the memory of two women who were such young children when they experienced this. And so very fortunately, there are organizations like the Shoah Foundation that did put together a massive effort in the mid-1990s to interview as many people as they could to document them with these, some of them are very long, 10 hours of tape of video of interviewing people. And so I found as many people as I could, found their testimonies of people who were in ghetto at the time, and I watched them all, and I watched them many, many times. And in part it's to verify, in journalism, the idea is to, if you have an account, you have to verify it. You have to check it and make sure that it's an account that's has multiple sources, and so that the story has as much ground to stand on as possible. And that was very difficult here because, of course, there aren't many survivors who are available or alive to speak to me. And that was the best way I could do it. And in this way, it opened up a whole community of people. And it's really wonderful. And there were times when I was so deeply immersed in this that I had to remind myself that they were no longer alive, that they felt so alive to me. And it really provided an understanding of this town and this place where this family lived, and then not just what happened in their family camp, but what happened in the forest. And the experience ranged quite a bit, and it helped not only give me an education on the events that transpired, but in having a better perspective of what made this experience unique or different, or what made it sort of universal, at least what was happening in the woods. And then, of course, the World War II and the Holocaust is an extremely well-researched history, and so I read as much as I could about these experiences and interviewed people who were subject matter experts and things like that.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Katz. I think it's fabulous what you're doing. My
you.
parents, I was born in a refugee camp in Berlin after they were, I guess, freed. They were in the woods, and they talked about it all the time. Dad was 97 when he died. Mom was 86. And till his dying breath, they talked about it because they didn't want us to forget. And they were interviewed by Steven Spielberg, survivors of the Shoah. What I wanted to bring out is several things. How it changed the epigenetics of our lives, how my sisters and I, it changed us as people, it changed our perception of other people, it changed how we feel about guilt and food and everything. And I remember asking Dr. Dennis Charney years ago, he's chief psychiatrist at Mount Sinai, how did my parents survive? She saw mother's head chopped off. She saw her father hung. My father lost his wife and kids. How did they survive? And not only survive, they flourished. And Dr. Charney said they had the resilience gene. And you've inherited the resilience gene. And David, you kept on saying, but how do these people survive? Everybody has a resilience gene. And it shows you, yesterday we celebrated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and how people move on. That's human nature. And that's what I wanted to point out.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's right. And I think in the Lazowski and Rabinowitz and Langerman families, is Toby's married name, they all ask themselves a little bit, what would Miriam do? I think that moment is something that lives on in them, in addition to the resilience gene, right? That it's just, they managed to flourish after the war as well. And I think that's part of it for them, yeah.
Rebecca, we got a question by email from Jerome who asks, what was it like researching this book as opposed to writing War Dogs, and how are the two processes different?
Researching War Dogs brought me outside of my head and outside of my writing office a lot more. I spent a lot of time on military bases, which was, at first it was a little bit unnerving, and then it was really interesting and exciting. And in some ways, it was similar because, of course, you're still talking about war. It's from a very different perspective and point of view. I was interviewing and working with soldiers and Marines. But the trauma is not completely different. I mean, what they experienced lives on in them in the same way. But also, their memories too sort of fade over time, and certain things are closer than others. It's more immediate, or it needs to be pulled back out of them, and those are difficult conversations to have. Yeah, I think also too, it's just it was a lot of history. It was a lot of reading. It wasn't as much contact with people, and it's just a much bigger topic. And I had a much longer period of time to do it. And you know, that is one of the things that's interesting. You might ask the same questions over and over again, but you're never going to have the same conversation. And I feel so fortunate that I had that much time with Ruth and Toby and Rabbi Lazowski and their children, and with Ted Weinstone, because it just provided, you know, with Ruth, it would be, you know, we would look at pictures and it would spark memories that she hadn't shared with me before, and we'd been doing this for 2 years already, and that was wonderful. And with Toby, I've said this before, it was a little bit like planting a seed. We'd have a conversation, and then 3 days later she'd call me and she'd say, I just can't believe it, I remembered this thing, or I remembered this person's name. So it was interesting, both really valuable, both very meaningful to me personally, but very different research.
Hi, I'm Melina. I have 2 questions for you. First, how did you combine this story and decide you were going to write this? And do you have a memory that sticks out the most during speaking to Ruth or Toby or one of the other people you interviewed that has stuck with you the most?
Well, to answer your first question, this was sort of a story that I had grown up with, because when I was young, ever since the time I was 5 years old, my parents were members of the synagogue where Philip Lazowski was a rabbi and Ruth Rabinowitz Lazowski was his wife. And so it was, at least for my family, a very familial community, and we were with them a lot, and the story was always there. And so having finally answered the question, you know, after War Dogs, what did I want to do next? I knew I wanted it to be a story that I cared about, and so I thought, okay, this might be a wonderful thing to write about, if only I can find enough story, you know, to mix in with their memories of what they remembered. And then in terms of what sticks out, I mean, so much does. There was so many conversations. One of my favorite moments, though, was with Ruth. I spent a lot of time in their house, which, of course, is not very far from the house that I grew up in. And Ruth, for anyone who knows her, and there are people in this audience who know her very well, she is just a joyful, happy, vibrant, vivacious person. She's always ready to experience things. She and Rabbi have traveled the world many times over. You know, they want to engage people. They want to go places. They want to do. They want to be. They want to live. They want to, you know, celebrate. And Ruth was remembering. You know, I was asking her about what was it like to be, you know, a Jewish refugee or somebody who had just come to the United States and was in school with American kids, and it was tough on them both. I don't think that they were very warmly recepted by the American Jewish kids in their school, and she was a little bit less affected, I think. She made friends with other, you know, foreign kids, and there was a talent show in her junior high school, and she sang this song, Mattanata, which is half in English and half in Italian. And we found, you know, I said, well, we can find the music to that. I can pull it up. She was always very amazed at my Google skills. She thought that was pretty incredible. And so we found the song, and then she sang it for me. And, you know, it was a wonderful memory, and she just sang the whole thing. And that was something I was very grateful to have experienced with her.
We'll take one more question from the live stream and then wrap it up. Michael asks, how can Holocaust educators best teach using this book?
Well, I think the thing to teach, and as David brought up, throughout our conversation, is to show the lives before, and to show, yes, of course, to talk about what happened to them in the Holocaust, and then to show how they recovered. And I think, that they kept their marriage intact, they kept their family intact, they kept their humanity intact, their appetite for joy and for happiness intact. That was a pretty hard thing to do, but they did it, and I think that that's a really important lesson. It's not so much about numbers, although the numbers are important. We want to know what happened and to how many people, but I think we want to know the people, and I think that's more important. We need to know the stories.
Rebecca and David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
We're really proud to join in the celebration of this book launch, a remarkable, well-researched, well-written book, an important book. We hope you found the conversation interesting today, and we'll go purchase a copy of Into the Forest, a Holocaust story of survival, triumph, and love in our lobby, and get it signed by the author. Those of you joining us on the live stream can order the book at the link in the live stream chat. I hope you also take the lessons of this conversation out with you as we navigate our ever complicated and challenging world. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.